Rivers. If the meandering flows aren't majestic enough to look at, surely the deep canyons that they cut are a magnificent sight to us all. Rivers are literally a lifeline for all life on Earth, and they've certainly been extremely important parts of human civilization, stretching back to the dawn of civilization in places like the Tigris and Euphrates and Fertile Valley regions. In ancient times, rivers provided a source of food and water, and eventually even irrigation. And manipulating water to flow where we want it is not even exactly a new thing. There's documented ditches and channels being dug well into history, many thousands of years ago. But large-scale dams that dam some of our mightiest rivers are a relatively new phenomenon. Think the Hoover Dam or the Aswan Dam. In fact, I could continue to list on and on the many names of dams found around the world, and yes, even on our mightiest of rivers. Dams are sometimes thought of as engineering marvels, but dams are also indicted on causing major environmental destruction, and sometimes even catastrophic and deadly dam failures occur. It's more common than you think. We'll get to that in a bit. Today we're going to take a look at one of the biggest dams ever on one of the mightiest rivers, the Nile. It's being created as we speak, causing many to fear the worst. So what could go wrong? Climate abnormalities such as excessive drought or excessive rainfall can cause a dam and its reservoir not to operate properly or even fail. These are ongoing issues for the drying Colorado and even the Tigris and Euphrates again. But even without the risk of climate change causing water shortages, dams themselves can cause issues over time. The reservoirs don't exactly stay the same. When the reservoirs are first filled, when the dam is constructed, the water levels rise to a point that is often close to the highest they'll ever be in the future. And while this is especially true in a drying up southwest US, again, it is kind of a reservoir issue. You see, when you think about the way that reservoirs work, water fills up this newly created fake lake, and it brings along with it some other stuff. One thing it brings along is a lot of sediment, and that sediment tends to pile up in the reservoir. Another issue that can arise is that of too many dams. When a river is dammed multiple times, such as the case with the Colorado River, the dams upstream tend to lead to less flow downstream, and then there's another dam, and then another dam, and then another dam, to the point where the flows are so low that in the case of the Colorado River, that river doesn't even meet its actual delta there in the Gulf of Baja. But putting all that aside, there's one more issue that can arise with dams, and that is dam failure. Now you might be thinking this is a pretty low risk. Most dams are engineering marvels, and so most of the properly made dams probably don't fail, right? Well, that's not always the case. Take, for instance, Mulholland's Dam. In the early 1900s, Mulholland was the man that moved water. He needed water for the growing investments in real estate projects in the Los Angeles area. Now, Los Angeles actually grew because of Mulholland's projects. He actually drained a lake in the Owens Valley. I talked all about this in a full-length video, so check out that. Why that lake dried up does have to do with Mulholland's projects. But he also did some other projects north of that area, and one of those was the St. Francis Dam. But the St. Francis Dam is infamously known for being one of the largest catastrophes in U.S. history because that dam failed, and it killed a lot of people. And perhaps now you're thinking, yeah, but that was back then. We've gotten better now, right? Well, don't forget the Oroville, California dam issues and the 1975 dam collapse in China that killed tens of thousands. More recently, we experienced the completely catastrophic dam failures that happened in Libya, where tens of thousands of people are reported to have died from that. In fact, you might be a little frightened to take a look at reports like this that predict or discuss the infrastructural integrity of dams in history and today. It's not so comforting. According to this in-depth Stanford study, since 1900, almost every year has seen a dam failure. On average, there's been about 10 dam failures a year, but since 1980, that average has been 24 dams a year. Yeah, it's going up. And about 4% of these dam failures have resulted in at least one fatality. What's worse, climate change research has been indicating major infrastructure failures in the U.S., like this report that shows that climate change may result in 1 in 4 steel bridges collapsing by 2040. A trend that will likely be a widespread global issue. And for these reasons, many people are objecting a new massive dam project, a dam on the Nile. The Nile, being one of the world's largest river systems, is Africa's longest river, flowing northward to the Mediterranean Sea. Along its incredible journey, the Nile River runs through or borders 10 African countries, including Sudan and South Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Congo, Rwanda, Tanzania, Burundi, and of course, Egypt. As a new large dam is being placed on the Nile, it's important to know that it isn't the first time the Nile has been dammed. This image shows remnants of the Sa'd al-Kafara Dam in Egypt from 3000 BC. But of course, this wouldn't be Egypt's only go at damming the Nile. In 1971, Egypt built one of the world's largest dam projects known as the Aswan Dam. It's generated a large amount of Egypt's electrical energy. And the latest dam on the Nile is GERD, or the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The dam project cost billions, and it's over a mile long and 476 feet high, making it taller than the Aswan Dam. The reservoir it's creating has a water volume of 74 kilometers cubed, 3 times the volume of Ethiopia's largest lake, Lake Tana. Proponents of this dam say it will double Ethiopia's electricity production and improve poverty issues and allow for agricultural expansion. At full capacity, it's projected to generate more than 5,000 megawatts, potentially bringing electricity to the 60 million people in Ethiopia who currently do not have access. Then in September 2023, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia announced, "It is with great pleasure that I announce the successful completion of the 4th and final filling of the Renaissance Dam." And with that announcement, problems are already brewing. Egypt and Sudan have feared that the dam will severely reduce their share of Nile water, because it will, of course. They've repeatedly asked Ethiopia to halt the filling of the reservoir until they could all work out a fair use agreement. The Egyptian Foreign Ministry labeled Ethiopia's actions of filling the dam as illegal. Meanwhile, Egypt's already experiencing water scarcity and sees the dam as an existential threat since it relies on the Nile for about 97% of its water needs. The combination of environmental degradation and climate change causing lower rainfall and higher temperatures means that many African nations, including Ethiopia and Sudan, will experience a drop of at least 20% of their crop yields by 2050. And in Egypt, the UN has predicted that Egypt could run out of water by 2025. And Sudan, where the awful Darfur conflict has been labeled basically a war over water, is at risk of severe drought as a result of climate change. In fact, Sudan has been a bit less vocal about the dam because they are still suffering from the pains of civil war. Ethiopia's response to these fears is to state that the dam will simply not reduce the volume of water downstream. But scientists are warning that any further disruption to the Nile's ecosystem could cause irreversible damage to the region. This fan of green in northern Egypt is the Nile Delta. It's a fertile area that was created literally by the Nile bringing downstream all of its silt. The Nile is unique because it flows north, and it does so for about 7,000 kilometers distance. That's comparable to the distance between London and New York. It moves about 27,000 bathtubs worth of water every second, and with that a lot of sediment, much of which gets deposited in the Nile Delta, or at least it used to. This delta used to naturally flood on an annual basis, but that ended with Egypt's building of the Aswan Dam. Since the delta no longer receives that annual supply of sediments and the accompanying nutrients from upstream, the soils of the floodplain have become poorer, leading to the use of a large quantity of fertilizer. Egypt's coastline experiences significant loss of land to the sea, in some places about 90 meters to or 100 yards per year. The low-lying Nile Delta is particularly vulnerable to sea level rise associated with our changing climate, but this has been exacerbated by the lack of sediment deposited due to the alteration of the flow via dams like the Aswan Dam. The Nile is believed to be about 25 million years old and today is the oldest, longest river on Earth, and it contains more than 100 islands. But the construction of dams on the Nile, including the most recent Renaissance Dam, is expected to further impact the biodiversity of the wetlands, the delta, and those islands, and of course the wildlife and people who depend on them. It's pretty clear. Dams have a damning impact on rivers and the associated wetland environments. Is it okay for Egypt to have a dam and not Ethiopia? Well, that's a socio-political issue that I'll save for another day. But what's not debatable is whether or not it will have long-term impacts on the ecological systems. Yes, it will. And that's not a good thing because even if you don't live along the Nile, you depend on a healthy Nile. Increasingly more nutrients, and that's not a good thing despite how it sounds, and more pollutants like fertilizers and sewage are running off into the environment. But wetlands are known to help filter out such contaminants. Wetlands are extremely important habitat for animals, migratory birds, and fish, even commercially important fish. Functioning wetlands help protect the environment and even local communities from flooding. It's also been discovered that wetlands capture and store large amounts of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases and store it in their plants and soil. It's a process known as carbon sequestration. So instead of coming up with complex ways to sequester carbon, we could actually just restore healthy wetlands to mitigate against climate change. Researchers studying Lake Manzala in the Deltaic region of Egypt have found that between 2013 and 2021, about half of the floating plants were destroyed or removed. It was done for an increase in agricultural lands, and that decrease in plants led to a decrease in carbon storage. And clearly dams and the associated infrastructure projects, agriculture and irrigation are a big part of the reason why wetlands around these river systems gets destroyed. And the final concern with any large dam project is, what if it were to fail, like some of the other dams we talked about here? Well, that would result in a large humanitarian crisis, perhaps worse than the 2023 Libyan floods, or even worse than the 1975 Chinese floods. Millions of people live along the Nile, and the world depends on the Nile.